Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and good evening to everybody. My name is Maysoon, and I'll be moderating the session this evening with Dr. Max. Just a bit of background about this session. So I don't know how much of Muslim Votes Matter. We're grassroots organisations, and one of our key pillars is about education and about being informed. And using that to be able to make real change. And we're talking real systemic change. So today's session is looking at anti-Semitism, which is part 2 to our series on racism in Australia, where we had a focus on Islamophobia last week with Dr. Nord from the Islamophobia Registry. And this week, we're really excited to have Dr. Max, who will be talking to us about anti-Semitism. Just before we do continue, though, we'd like to open our proceedings with the remembrance of our Creator. And this is just a prayer I'd like to start the session with. Alhamdulillah, indeed, all praise is due to Allah. We praise Him and seek His help and forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evil of our souls and our wrongdoings. He whom Allah guides, none can misguide. And he whom Allah leaves to go astray, none can guide. I bear witness that there is no God except Allah alone, without any partners. And I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his servant and messenger. At this point, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all respectively meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who are here with us today. And I'd like to make it known that sovereignty has never been ceded. It always has, it always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. We recognise the past atrocities against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this land, and that Australia was founded on the genocide and dispossession of First Nations people. We acknowledge that colonial structures and policies remain in place today, and recognise the ongoing struggles of First Nations people in dismantling those structures. So much of what the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have endured to date is recognisable. And in the oppression being committed against our brothers and sisters right now in Palestine and the surrounding regions. At this very moment in time, we are indeed living in a very tragic period of human history. I'd also now like to introduce our guest, Dr. Max Kaiser, who is the Executive Director of Jewish Council, and we feel really privileged to be hosting this session with Max. Just a bit of background, Max, I know you don't really like talking about yourself, so I'll just give a brief background to Max. He's a scholar and expert on anti-Semitism and Australian Jewish history. He completed his PhD at the University of Melbourne with a thesis titled Between Nationalism and Assimilation, Jewish Antifascism in Australia in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So he's an expert and a historian on many topics. So we're really excited to be hosting this session with someone like Max and his caliber. Just a few basic housekeeping. We'd like to just ask everyone to be respectful of others' opinions and contributions. We've got everyone's speakers on mute just to limit background noise throughout the session. But if you would like to contribute, please do so via the meeting chat, which is made available to you. And we do recommend that you enable speaker view by clicking view icon at the top right-hand side. So let's start the session then. Give me 1 second. So Max, might just get you to start off by giving us a brief background of the Australian Jewish Council, and just inform the audience and tell us more about the conception of it when it started, and what was sort of the driver behind its creation.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks very much for having me, Maysoon, and the whole team. Really glad to be here and doing this talk with Muslim Votes Matter. And I guess, I just also want to acknowledge that I'm coming from Melbourne, from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So the Jewish Council of Australia started almost exactly 1 year ago. So it started in February 2024, and it definitely, the genesis of it was the genocide in Gaza and the situation that we found ourselves in, I guess, responding to that from Australia. And the sort of original impetus was to have a strong voice in the media that could speak out in the mainstream media, to basically contest the idea that criticism of Israel was anti-Semitic. And I know that's what we're going to talk about a bit tonight. But that really was sort of the main thing that we thought, well, we're sort of, Jewish lawyers, human rights experts, academics, scholars. We do have expertise in this area, and we're going to make sure to use that expertise to speak out and say that that's not what anti-Semitism is. It's entirely valid to criticize Israel. Israel, in fact, should definitely be being criticized very heavily for its genocidal conduct and breaking of, myriad international laws. And that narrative needed to be put out by a Jewish voice, unfortunately, in the mainstream media. So it started off that way. We kind of changed a little bit as we went, and we're still changing and evolving to a certain extent. We also realized that there was, in fact, a need for a strong public, sort of national Jewish voice organization that was going to be critical of Australian government policy and calling on Australia to do better in terms of holding Israel to account. So having that sort of, I guess, political advocacy and having that strong Jewish voice, and that's something that people really valued about what we were doing. And then sort of more broadly, we've got other aims as well, which is sort of to work together with other groups like Muslim Votes Matter and other Muslim, Palestinian, other groups facing racism in Australia in order to sort of form coalitions and form alliances against racism and anti-Semitism together. So that's an important aspect of what we do, is sort of forming coalitions and working with other groups. And then I guess the last bit of what we do is sort of where we're going to more and more, which is sort of the community engagement, like Jewish community engagement. So we have over 1,000 Jews who have signed up to our core principles of the Jewish Council of Australia. We've got about 20 discussion groups all around Australia that have been set up. And we're starting to do sort of more in-person events as well, and to sort of build those sort of grassroots networks.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
Look forward to seeing more of that activity. I've seen some of the work that you've launched in the last 2 weeks, some of the campaigns that have come through, which have been quite impactful, I think, just as a very different voice to what we're seeing in other parts of the media, which actually brings me on to the next question, which is, just telling us more about the Jewish community in Australia. How diverse is it? One thing we talked about is, let's do some myth busting. It's clearly not a homogenous group. So give us a bit of more into understanding, well, how diverse is it? And what are the things that we should know, you'd like us to know about the Jewish community in Australia?
Yeah, I think one thing that I always, kind of want to impress upon people is, when we're talking about like the Jewish community in Australia, is that it's fairly small. So there's about 100,000 of us, but that's according to census figures, probably a few more than that. And sort of most Jews live in Melbourne and Sydney, though there are Jews all around Australia, and that was kind of one of the interesting things that we discovered when we set up the discussion groups, is that we had people from all over regional areas who were interested in getting involved, and wanted to sort of find community. But yeah, most Jews are in Melbourne and Sydney. It is diverse communities. So people are from all sorts of different backgrounds. Majority are from European backgrounds of different sorts, but there's also Middle Eastern Jews, South African Jews, Russian Jews. And I guess also, I think probably another thing that people maybe don't realize is that Jews, although Judaism is a religion, people like myself, for instance, I'm like a secular cultural Jew, and there's probably most Jews, or like about over half of Jews don't attend synagogue regularly. I can't remember. It's been a shameful while since I was last in a synagogue, but that's not sort of the core of my Jewish identity. So, and it's not necessarily the core of many Jews' Jewish identity. There's a whole different ways that people sort of interact with that Jewishness,
Yeah.
that isn't necessarily through religion, and even with religion, people interact with it in different ways. And there's a whole spectrum of ultra Orthodox through
Mm.
to Reform sort of Jews who take different aspects of that religion, and it means
Yeah.
different things in their lives. So
Yeah.
yeah, it is a very diverse community, and I guess that's part of what we try to get across in terms of resisting the sort of, yeah, as you say, that homogenization
Yeah.
of what a Jewish person is, or what the Jewish
Yeah.
community is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned previously that religion doesn't sort of form your identity of being Jewish. What are the different ways that the community does identify when it comes to being Jewish?
So religion is definitely important,
Mm.
and it is for probably yeah, for the majority of Jews in Australia, they do have some form of religious,
Mm.
practice or conviction, and it also is, of course, how people interact with family and community is often through different like religious like Shabbat, or the different festivals like Purim, Passover, Yom Kippur. Like these are very important things to Jews, even those Jews who maybe are not,
Just
that religious,
yeah.
practicing or believing in God. There
Yeah.
is sort of that core to a lot of different Jewish practice. But I
Yeah.
think, like for me, my Jewish identity is the background is more, I guess, sort of political and
Yeah.
cultural. Like my well, yeah, like my grandfather was very involved in an organization called the Jewish Council to Combat Fascism and Anti-Semitism.
Oh,
This was in the 1940s, and as you mentioned, that's sort of what I did my PhD
yeah.
and my book on. And that was really about articulating an idea of being Jewish as um, definitely strong sort of culture, and it was to do with
Mm.
like Yiddish culture and other forms of Jewish culture, like literature and
Mm.
um, other sort of art forms. Well, it was also about having this sort of political solidarity and these political ideas that a core part of their Jewish identity. And my Jewish identity is about precisely, joining with others in solidarity, fighting racism, fighting colonialism, fighting fascism, um, and forming sorts of, yeah, different ways of belonging and identifying through that.
Mm. Yeah. Well, that's actually a nice segue now, moving into something a bit more political. Um, as a Muslim and Palestinian background, my parents were both born in Palestine. It's quite easy for me to, have some strong emotions and opposition towards the genocide and the ethnic cleansing that is occurring in Palestine, because I've got my family, my wider community that's behind me. And I can, I've got people who can really relate to my feelings as well. Can you provide some insights into what the last 12 months have been for yourself, but also the Jewish Council? And you said, you've now got 1,000 members, or people who've sort of registered. What is it like? What has it been like for you for the last 12 months?
Yeah, I guess it's been, sort of a heartbreaking and horrifying time, for many reasons, but centrally, the genocide in Gaza. And it's obviously not comparing my experience in any way to Palestinians, but it's been, heavily traumatic, I think, for anyone who's following it in different ways, depending on your position. And I think, part of what happens in what we've seen in the Jewish community is I mean, there were already a lot of tensions around around Palestine and around Israel, but we've sort of seen it become very extremely polarized. So
Mm,
that is, something that we have to acknowledge, that a big part of the Jewish community has become even more Zionist, even more extreme, and very much backing Netanyahu all the way, the most
yeah.
extreme genocidal ideas and policies that, are out there, and that's an extreme forms of hate have taken hold, unfortunately, in some segments of the Jewish community.
Mm,
But then we've also seen, on the other hand,
mm,
the Jewish Council emerge, a whole bunch of other groups actually, who are very critical of Israel. And those groups have also been gaining a lot of strength. And like you say, we've
mm,
had 1,000 people sign up, and sort of those sort of voices are becoming, I guess, more. I think people are seeing the necessity to
yeah.
speak up.
And
Um,
and and
and
has that been driven by the polarization that's increased? Or does that reflect that polarization that has sort of grown in the last 12 months within the community?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess it's one of those ones where it's kind of like there's two aspects to it. Like there's also, like, I think, an uh intense aspect where anyone who speaks up gets
Yeah.
an amazing amount of abuse and pushback from those more sort of right
Mm,
wing and far right,
yeah.
um, fascist, I think,
Yeah.
element of the Jewish community, that people get um, do cop it, and
Mm,
that's certainly the most amount of anti-Semitic abuse that we face at the Jewish Council actually comes from other Jews, comes from Zionists and people saying, that we're Holocaust collaborators and things
yeah.
like that. So, but I think despite that, people have still, have said we have to stand up. Like
Yeah.
we do have to stay true to what we believe. We have to, I think a lot of people have educated themselves as well.
Mm,
And that's, throughout the wider community.
yeah.
But yeah, I think a whole bunch of people, didn't know anything, or only sort of knew what they'd heard through, um,
Mm,
the Jewish news or other outlets that are spreading basically propaganda. And people have sort of woken up. Everyone's seen, like, people, you can go straight to Instagram and, see what's happening straight from
yeah.
Gaza. So I think that that's really hard to ignore for a lot of people and a lot of the Jewish community.
And
And
are
then
you
people have,
getting,
yeah,
like,
and
it sounds like you're getting both ends. It's like you're getting quite strong, abuse on the one hand, but it sounds like you're also getting quite a bit of encouragement from other parts of the community as well.
yeah, absolutely. And it definitely varies. Like some days our inbox will be,
Yeah.
90% abuse, and sometimes it'll be 90% support. So,
Yeah.
it really depends. But like we have, yeah, I think it's sort of a growing segment of the community that is, very thankful that the Jewish Council exists, wants to get involved, wants to help out. And
Yeah.
yeah, we're definitely seeing that.
Yeah. And what kind of what kind of activities do you see you moving into? We sort of know where it started and the
Mm.
reason why it started, but seeing the change within the community itself, where are you seeing some of the opportunity and where you see your organization growing into?
Yeah, I think it is becoming more of that community organization, that when
Yeah.
we did start, it was really about, presenting ourselves as experts, and that was sort
Mm,
of how the voice that we claimed.
mm,
Whereas now, I think we can say, we never claim to speak for the whole of the Jewish
yeah.
community, but we can say we're speaking for a significant segment of the Jewish community, and those voices need to be heard.
Mm,
So that, I think, is going to be a little bit more of where we go, the discussion groups, and like even we had this event with Dr. Gabor Mate, where we had 200
mm,
um, of our Jewish supporters come out and hear him speak in Melbourne, hoping that we can do more of that, and yeah, get some of the grassroots community going, and
right.
also hopefully do more things like this event with Muslim Votes Matter and other
Yeah.
amazing groups who are share those values and want to fight against all forms of racism in Australia.
Yeah, and we'll get on to that later on, but you know, like we're all fighting the same enemy, right? Right? You know, like racism, and we'll move on to that towards the end. But just what I'd like to move on to now is just anti-Semitism itself and how it's being portrayed and depicted in mainstream media. Just yet, I'd be interested to hear your view on what your thoughts are. Like, is that depiction accurate? And where does it stem? Like, where does anti-Semitism stem from in Australia, particularly?
Mm. Yeah, I guess I'll go with that last part first.
Yeah.
I mean, because I am a historian,
Yes.
so but I'll try and I won't start all the way back in. I won't start 2,000 years ago. But I think it's important when we're talking about, the history of um, anti-Semitism in Australia is that it's definitely not something that started, a couple of years ago. It's definitely not something that is stems from people being angry at Israel. Which, is so much of the discourse, and I think we'll get into it. We have to see like anti-Semitism as part of the history of racism in Australia. And of course, as you said in your intro, Maysoon, like we have to understand the history of Australian racism and its beginning in colonization. And the dispossession of First Nations people is really what sets the structure of Australian racism more generally.
Yeah.
And, we kind of have seen basically different influences on the development of Australian racism over, a couple of centuries.
Mm.
And it all basically stems from colonialism,
Yeah.
imperialism, and yeah, anti-Semitism isn't any different. So we have to see that, when anti-Semitism first kind of came to the fore in Australia was actually in the 1890s, which
Oh,
was
wow.
around, yeah, Federation, and it was
Yeah.
around when there was sort of that peak of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese
Yes.
sort of,
The gold rush.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and even after that as well, when
Mm.
the beginnings of the White Australia policy
Yeah.
were being formulated around the time of Australian Federation.
Mm.
And then the next wave of anti-Semitism was really in connection with broader international anti-Semitism in the 1930s when Nazism and fascism were on the rise. There was a famous um, incident where Australia was asked to take Jewish refugees, and the representative to this international conference where they were talking about the problem of German and Austrian refugees said, Australia does not have a racial problem and we're not desirous of importing one. So Jews were seen as this foreign, civilizational threat that had alternative values that was going to basically be undermining white Australia.
Yeah.
And then you saw the beginning of real mass migration, Jewish migration, if you can call it that. It's only
Mm.
really, um, yeah, 20 or 30,000 Jews who ended up migrating. But the Holocaust survivors after World War II, and again, there was this, anti-migrant campaign against
Mm.
them, saying that they were going to undermine Australian labour standards, and that they were, yeah, basically people who had an alternative value system. But I think
Yeah.
the important thing to recognise as part of that, and when we're telling that sort of history, is like not that it's actually that unique. Like that
Mm.
sort of happens to, I
Across
guess,
all
the story with,
generations of migrants, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
story with almost all sort of waves of different migrants who've come to Australia is that there's always been these sort of
Yeah.
anti-migrant scare campaigns,
Yeah.
and the structure of Australian white supremacy and racism means that there's some people who are, sort of permanently excluded from being
Mm.
white. But there's also these sort of shifting structures in the middle where
Yeah.
some people are shifting structures of whiteness where you can sort of be allowed in if you sort of, act the right way or you participate in racism. So
There's
that's part
different shades of white.
different shades of white. So
Yeah.
that's part of where Australian Jews fit in, is sort of that, sometimes being thought of as white and sometimes not. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, but obviously the underlying issue then is like is that structure of whiteness. Like, is
Yeah.
that structure that allows the exclusion or discrimination against anyone. So
Yeah.
that's why, I think at the Jewish Council are so sort of kind of despair at how anti-Semitism gets treated today, which is
Yeah.
not connected to, in the mainstream media, not connected to other forms of racism, treated as an exceptional form or unique form of racism.
Mm.
And of course, treated as if, anti-Israel protests are anti-Semitic, when, they're not, as we said before. It's completely valid to criticize Israel and to be out there on the streets protesting Israel, and that is not anti-Semitism. But that is how, particularly the conservative media, talks about anti-Semitism. I mean, and the other way, I suppose, since the arson attack on the Yiddish synagogue towards the
Mm.
end of last year, there's also been this focus on these big sort of arson attacks or graffiti
Yes.
attacks, and that being anti-Semitism. And
Yeah.
of course, they are instances of anti-Semitism,
Mm.
but if that's not, it's sort of, if we just focus on those incidents, then we don't really get to understand sort of the roots of some of them and sort of how racism operates more generally.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
we talk to, people whose kids are being bullied at school for being Jewish.
Yes. Yes.
Like, the problem, I think, with only focusing on those sort of larger incidents is it becomes a law and order issue
Yes.
and becomes somehow a, terrorist
Band-Aid.
issue or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
and people think that policing is sort of the answer.
Mm.
Get more police out there, we arrest more people, we'll be able to
Mm.
solve racism. Unfortunately, it really doesn't work like that. Like,
Yeah.
there's in fact can be very counterproductive.
Yeah, and if look, I guess you would have listened to Dr. Noura last week, or 2 weeks ago actually, in regards to Islamophobia, and anti-Muslim, etc. Do you see an overlap between the two?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think that, I mean, I guess that's part of what we've seen over the past, 15 months in the period of the genocide, has been these big
Mm.
increases in Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian
Yeah.
racism, and anti-Semitism all at the same time. And I think that, unfortunately, there's, people out there who interpret global events and see these things through a racial lens,
Yeah.
and use this sort of
It's an
thing
opportunity, right?
as an
Yeah.
opportunity. And I
Yeah.
think, but I think also the other aspect to it, which we have to, talk about, I think,
Mm.
is that, unfortunately, there's this way that the mainstream media, Zionists, politicians,
Mm.
um, in fact, use Jews against Muslims and Palestinians. So, basically, they claim that they themselves are, fighting against anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
that they are defenders of Jewish people, but that the threats to Jewish people are Muslims, are Palestinians. So there's this way that the different groups are sort of used against each other. And
Yeah.
not only is that, using Jews to increase Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism and drive anti-migrant agenda, it
Yeah.
also has this effect of, flattening Jewish identity, projecting this image of, one version of what Jews are, and
Mm.
using Jews instrumentally as political footballs,
Yeah.
in a way that, in fact, doesn't make us any safer either, and
Yeah.
doesn't combat anti-Semitism at all, and in fact does the opposite.
Yeah. And do you feel that Islamophobia is treated differently to how anti-Semitism is?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think that that's part of, some of the complexities of what we're dealing with is, we have like um, senior Liberal Party politicians who
Mm.
deny that Islamophobia even exists.
Yeah, that's right.
And the politicians, like themselves, they encourage Islamophobia every single day. Like it's
Mm,
just sort of relentless, and and anti-Semitism gets treated in this really different way. I mean, as I've suggested, even though sort of superficially it seems like they do take it more seriously,
yeah,
um, sort of structurally, I don't think they take it seriously at all because in order to address anti-Semitism, you're going to have to address all forms of racism.
yes.
So, but yeah, they do get treated very, very differently.
Yeah. So there's a question that's come from the audience. Do you think that the overuse, incorrect use of anti-Semitism accusations is very short-sighted? Is it likely to cause genuine issues for the Jewish community in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that's part of the problem that we sort of see. Yeah, so I mean, people might not realize, but there's been a very deliberate propaganda attempt, by different Zionist organizations, by Israel itself, to change what anti-Semitism is and to establish the idea that somehow anti-Semitism is the ultimate target of anti-Semitism is Israel, and that Israel is some form of collective
Mm,
Jew, and
mm,
that if you
yeah,
criticize this collective Jew, then that is what anti-Semitism is. And it's been this very deliberate propaganda effort over multiple decades in order to change that. So anti-Semitism isn't, you know, yeah, what it actually is, which is racism against
yeah,
Jews.
yeah.
So, and yeah, I do think it's dangerous because, yeah, it means that people don't actually take it seriously. People get confused when we say and what anti-Semitism is. And
Yeah,
yeah,
and yeah, I think you're right. I think there is huge risk um in diluting the definition. Um, particularly if you're going to have real attacks on the Jewish community. For the stuff that you've talked about, the descriptions that you've talked about in terms of, rooted in racism. So yeah, there is a big risk there. I might go on to a question that's come up and we sort of had it lined up, and it's touches on a lot of what you've already talked about, is just what's happened recently with Australian universities now agreeing to this new definition of anti-Semitism, in particular in reference to Israel. Just tell us more about this definition, just for the audience. What does it mean? And what are your thoughts as the Jewish Council of Australia? What are your thoughts on it? Are you opposed to this view? And what can we do about it?
yeah, yeah. I mean, in short, we're definitely opposed to it. So for people who don't know, basically, throughout sort of it's basically come up with towards the end of last year. It was come up with by the group of 8 universities, which are the sort of, elite fancy universities in Australia. They adopted it and then they have, in consultation, given it to Universities Australia, which is the body that represents all universities. And then they apparently had a vote and they all adopted it. I mean, I think and I won't go through the all aspects of the definition and the sort of academic critique of it, and encourage people to have a look on our website if you're interested to see. But essentially, it repeats a lot of the issues with the people might have heard of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is
You might want to explain that, Max.
yeah, that's the
Yeah.
International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, and it's basically, the next step out of what I was talking about before, which is that sort of propaganda campaign that's been going for multiple decades in order to expand what anti-Semitism is and say that anti-Semitism is different forms of criticism of Israel. So this new definition, which the different universities have apparently officially adopted, basically says that calling for the elimination of the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. So, and of course, it's not clear what that means, elimination of Israel, but many, 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 many people, Palestinians, Jews, Israelis, people all around the world who want to see a more just solution in that part of the world, will call for situation where there's one person, one vote, everyone has equality and freedom between the river and the sea.
Yeah.
That potentially could be interpreted now as being anti-Semitic under this sort of thing. So it's not a good definition of anti-Semitism, doesn't help anyone. And I think what's also important to get across is that, it's been adopted, but how that actually gets implemented is going to be up to the different universities. So it's not like it goes automatically into their sort of, student complaints management mechanism or how that they deal with disciplinary matters. None of that. It's still very much going to be up to the different universities. But the overall point of this definition and other definitions like it, is to have this chilling effect on protest and pro-Palestine academic speech, protest speech, and Palestinian political expression on campuses. So the aim is to make people afraid. The aim is to confuse the issue. The aim is to, frankly, to pit different communities against each other, to make Jews afraid as well of Palestinians, which is what this sort of thing does. So yeah, that's why it sort of has to be very strongly resisted. And yeah, we definitely advocate that people do that. Working on what the best strategy is with some other groups is going to be to do that.
Right. Yeah, I think it's definitely
definitely
something, we should keep an eye on.
Yeah, and if you have contacts at a university, if you work at a university, if you study at a university, if you're any part of university community, definitely write to your vice chancellor, write to the people in power and ask them about it and voice your strong criticism.
There's a question that's come up that I might run past you. What can we do to disassociate the Muslim community from being anti-Semitic? Because it does come up, and if you have a look at who's been, who the culprits have been, who's been convicted, they haven't been Muslim, they haven't been pro-Palestinians, the pro-Palestinian mob, and this, when you hear politicians talk about rhetoric such as they should be deported, that's always making the assumption that they're going to be Muslim, they're going to be Arab, but in actual fact, none of them have been. So how do we fight that? And how do we work together to ensure that that rhetoric doesn't continue? Because it is having an impact on social cohesion. It is having an impact on the Muslim community as well.
Yeah, it's such a good question and difficult one for me to answer because, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, you don't want to, I guess, be like sort of defensive about it because it's a false accusation.
Yes.
It's not something that you should take on board because it's the accusation itself is part of that racism. Like it's part of Islamophobia. So I think that, it's not the reason why, but I think it is, I mean, I think that already people are doing exactly what they ought to be doing, which is like at pro-Palestinian marches, they are multicultural, inclusive. There's Jews there, there's everyone there. So I think that is sort of the best way to keep on that, is to say, well, the media might be saying one thing, but we know at the grassroots that is not what's going on. We know that Muslims and Jews don't hate each other. That's not the real picture of what's happening. So I think that we just have to sort of keep doing what we're doing and making those grassroots connections stronger. And then so people can just with confidence say, that's not true. It's fake. It's a false accusation.
But it's sort of like, we're talking about, it's quite a historical association as well. There's always the assumption that it's always been a religious war. They hate each other. They're never going to get along. It's like, actually, that's not really true. It's far from it. We are talking about, oppression here. We're talking about, the theft of land. So yeah, it's the rhetoric that really, and I really like your point around, if the more you try and disassociate, the fact that you even have to defend it itself actually doesn't even help the situation as well. It just reinforces it. So another question I might ask now, these are good questions, by the way, that are coming through. Okay. Does Jewish Council Australia have a stated view on what would be the just solution for the Palestinian plight?
No, is the short answer. I mean, we don't basically we don't have like a detailed policy platform, and I guess we think that Palestinians should be the ones determining what is the just solution. So all we advocate for is definitely against Israeli occupation and Israeli aggression, and we advocate for some sort of situation where there is justice, freedom, dignity, equality for all people. And I guess, yeah, we more than that, we sort of follow our Palestinian partners' lead.
Yeah, great. Another question. How are you doing as an anti-Zionist Jew? Do you cop community vitriol and do you feel isolated? And great respect and admiration for you and the team.
Oh, that's very nice. Thank you. Um,
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, yes, we do cop it a lot. And there's a lot of hate that comes through. So that is just something that you kind of have to grow a bit of a thick skin and deal with. I mean, in terms of me, sort of like my community and the people that I hang out with, or even my family, like people not everyone in my family agrees, but like that people are genuinely supportive and so that's not so much of an issue for me. For other members of the Jewish Council,
Mm.
that's definitely, and other Jews who speak out against Israel, like that is much more of an issue. A lot of family breakdowns,
Tough.
a lot of family arguments.
Particularly
Yeah,
family, yeah. I
yeah,
can imagine how hard it would be
yeah.
to navigate that whole scene. So yeah, hats off and yeah, lots of respect to people like yourself and yeah, what you have to endure. There's a couple of questions here. I'm a school teacher. I know from colleagues from other schools, once anti-Semitism or Islamophobia takes hold, it is incredibly difficult to manage. Do you have any advice for schools having to deal with this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would be interested to know from other people as well, because it's definitely something that's come up for us as well, is that we have, like sorry, like parents contacting us and wanting to know how they can deal with, anti-Semitic bullying or racism that's going on. And it's really tough. I think that kind of part of it needs to be taken out of a bit sort of de-individualized and recognize that it is sort of a broader issue of racism that does happen in schools. And I think that, in my view, there needs to be really explicit empowering of the teachers
Mhm.
to um, basically give anti-racist lessons and to take a lead, and for the teachers to be able to take a leadership role, understand what's going on in their classrooms. Of course, not we can't leave everything up to the teachers, but I do think that, depending on the situation, like it is important for schools to explicitly be providing leadership and saying this is not acceptable.
Yeah.
This is sort of what racism is. This is what you should do if you hear anyone being racist, etc. So I think that that's definitely important. And I think there needs to be sort of more programs explicitly
Yeah, look,
to
there is
do that.
for the person who's asked that question, shoot through an email because there are programs where they can actually come straight to the school and run workshops with the
Mm.
students. So yeah, if you're interested, shoot through because I've actually been involved in some of those, and a lot of them do happen in Muslims in Jewish schools as well. So please do if you're interested. There was one other question through. I'll come back to the next one actually. So new question. How do you see the impact of the Shoah Holocaust, i.e. trauma, fear, etc., as contributing to the strong pro-Zionist stance of Israel? Netanyahu, the extreme war in Gaza, the majority of Jewish people in Australia supporting Israel, i.e. the abused have become the abuser.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting one. I mean, I guess part of I can speak sort of more to the, I guess, Australian case. The Israel case is, yeah, anyway, that would take me a while to go through the history. But in Australia, like, we have this narrative about the Australian Jewish community, and the Jewish community itself has this narrative,
Right.
which is because so much of the community is Holocaust survivors, we have become very conservative and become very Zionist, as if
Wow.
it's some sort of natural,
That's
um,
interesting.
as if it's some sort of natural response, but
Wow.
it's not a natural response. And so, what the organization that I mentioned earlier, the Jewish Council to Combat Fascism and Anti-Semitism,
Mm,
many of them were Holocaust survivors. They were the most popular organization in the Jewish community. They were leading the Jewish community at that time in the 40s. Their response to the Holocaust and the memorialization of the Holocaust was
mm,
not Zionism. It was saying, okay, how do we apply this basically in an anti-fascist, anti-colonial way? Making comparisons between other like anti-colonial struggles at the time, like saying like India or Indonesia, saying that the what Jews needed to do was to involve themselves in world events, was to participate in these anti-racist, anti-colonial,
mm,
anti-fascist movements, not all go to Israel, like or not
mm.
sort of participate in the oppression of another people in Palestine. So, in fact, there was sort of like a other things happened, and I won't bore everyone with what exactly happened in the Australian Jewish community history. But I think it's very important to actually think about, yeah, that the Holocaust or like having this sort of traumatic, very, very traumatic incident was not either going to make people progressive
Yeah.
or conservative or Zionist or anti-Zionist. Like it's really depended on all these other factors. And there were these ways of like memorializing the Holocaust, taking that very seriously,
Mm,
and participating in Holocaust memory that were not going to go in Zionist sort of direction. So I
mm,
yeah, so in Australia, and I think that, there is that thread of Holocaust memorialization now in Australia
mm.
that happens where people say, because of the Holocaust, that's why we need Israel, and that's very
Yeah.
common. But
Yes.
you do also still see people applying the lessons of the Holocaust in this universal way, and like, teaching, keep and talking about, the problems of racism and hatred more generally. Often,
Mm,
very often, to be honest, it does, like if you go to a conservative Jewish institution or school, they're not going to be making comparisons with the Holocaust and genocide in Gaza. That's like,
yeah.
pretty guaranteed. But
Yeah.
certainly like that's I guess a tradition, that more progressive anti-racist tradition is something that I would take hold of. So I
Mm,
think that when we're talking about that Holocaust trauma and trauma of any genocide or any people, there's
yeah.
not an automatic sort of way that that gets fed in, but
Mm,
but it is definitely sort of ripe to be used and abused and
wow.
turned in a sort of different direction.
Okay, another question coming through. The anti-Semitism has been weaponized to suppress anti-Zionism. It will have a great impact on people not recognizing real anti-Semitism, which is what we're talking about, the dangers of this. How much awareness is there among the Jewish community of this takeover?
Mm. Well, it depends on which part of the Jewish community. I
Well,
mean, I think
I mean,
that,
you've just talked about the disconnect between what the Holocaust experience was and what's happening in Palestine with
mm,
genocide.
yeah,
So I'm assuming they won't see that point of view.
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the really unfortunate part is that so much of the yeah, well, I don't want to quantify, but let's say a big segment of the Jewish community buys it hook, line, and sinker, and that they say, yeah, I mean, that is what anti-Semitism is. They buy it when people say, yeah, that saying free Palestine or just something like that, or like having a cross to an Israeli flag. People genuinely believe that that is anti-Semitic, and they've been propagandized to believe that. Like that is has been very successful in some sections of the Jewish community. But I mean, then yeah, but then in other sections, I think, unlike the Jewish Council, people very much very getting very wise to it
Yes.
and critiquing it.
Yeah, it's quite dangerous though for the Jewish community to conflate the two together.
Yeah.
This is a comment. That's why many of us Jews for peace try to communicate, or that's what many of us Jews for peace try to communicate. Calling it anti-Semitic to criticize Israel puts Jews more at risk for hate crimes. There was one other question I wanted to come back to, which I thought was interesting, and I think we had a conversation about this a while back. Do you think Islamophobia needs to be treated in a different way?
In a different way to what it currently is.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
we talked about earlier the fact that there's some who are denying that it even exists. And then you've got anti-Semitism being treated very different to racism, other forms of
Yeah.
racism. I mean, my view is that any of this is bad and it should be treated as one. Racism, it all comes under the umbrella of racism. But someone who's got so much expertise in sort of racism and the history of racism, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's one of those things where there's no easy answers and no easy treatment to like these issues of racism. And I think like we can say like, that politicians can and the media should treat these equally, but the problem is really that there's very, strong structural reasons why they're not treated equally and why media, politicians, etc., the structures of the Australian state and Australian capitalism and imperialism all are structurally Islamophobic because there's many reasons, but like a large part of it is to keep these imperialist and hostile policies going, particularly in the Middle East, but elsewhere as well. Like it is this, civilizational sort of boogeyman, which we've seen different versions of throughout history, where in order to sort of bolster up the self-image and bolster militarism, bolster the idea that, we need to spend gazillions of dollars on the military and it's fine to invade other countries and it's fine to dictate to other countries what they do and what their policies ought to be and how resources ought to be shared around the world. All of that is backed up by racism. So including Islamophobia. So that's that's the hard part of it.
And conversely, would you say that's also the reason why there is so much strong support for Israel?
Yeah, although I guess definitely from countries around the world and obviously very, very obviously from the United States. But and I think that they have been successful in sort of folding the story of Israel and of, this sort of bastion of civilization amongst, um, um, sort of I won't repeat the sort of racist tropes, but you know what I'm getting at and that sort of feeds into these other sort of larger racist narratives. So they've been very successful in sort of coding Israel as sort of as white and coding it as sort of bastion against these sort of alien civilization that's going to threaten. So I think racism explains so much of it. And
it's rooted in capitalism as well.
I think so. I mean, it's hard to divorce sort of how the sort of system of nation states operates in the world today from those sort of underlying economic structures, like the US is the number one sort of imperialist country, and part of their agenda is, and part of how they've become the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world is through this program of economic exploitation using the military and using their influence in order to become that wealthy and in order to perpetuate those structures, those unequal world scale structures of how international trade works, who owns everything,
Yes.
multinational companies, etc.
Yes.
So you can't separate that sort of system of nation
Absolutely.
state
Yeah.
imperialism from capitalism.
Yeah. Look, we're drawing to a close. Just a few comments. Thank you for this very special event. I hope we can have more joint discussions with our Jewish brothers and sisters in the future. We can show everyone what social cohesion really means in the most positive way. Thumbs up to that. And there was one question I just want to bring up because it was more about understanding how they can help. Yeah, so how can non-Jews support the work of GCA? I know there are discussion groups which I would be interested to participate in and connect and build bridges with non-Zionist Jews in Melbourne, but not sure if a non-Jew would be welcome at this or if that's the intention of those discussion groups. Bearing in mind, Jews are a small minority and it might be the aim of those groups not to get overwhelmed by large numbers of non-Jews.
Yeah, I think in terms of the discussion groups, they are mostly Jewish, which is that's not a strict rule. But yeah, they are mostly Jewish. But there's definitely other ways to, I suppose, get involved and support us. Definitely just, following us on social media or signing up to our mailing list and sharing different things. I guess we definitely hope to have more in-person events as well, where people can actually, meet up. So I think sort of watch this space is the main thing, but definitely sign up to our newsletter, and stay in touch. And if you're send us an email.
Right, thank you. I think that really brings us to a close now. So Max, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight and absolute pleasure to spend the last hour with you. I'm sure we can spend days talking about so many different topics, but yeah, you are a wealth of knowledge, and we really appreciate you joining us on this session and collaborating with us. And yeah, hopefully this will pave way for more events in the future where we can partner up and as one of our guests said, demonstrate what social cohesion is and what it looks like. So thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great to be here.
Thank you.